I had barely finished unloading the last box when the knock came, a sharp, obnoxiously fast rapping on the weather-worn wood of my front porch that suggested urgency with a sprinkle of entitlement, like someone was offended I hadn't already. Opened the door. I set the box of kitchen supplies on the cracked hardwood floor and stepped around the couch that was still half covered in a tarp, brushing my dusty palms on my jeans before turning the knob. The woman standing there had that air about her, the overly crisp white blouse that was too clean for mountain living, the oversized sunglasses perched atop her head like a tiara of suburban judgment, and the HOA name badge clipped to her breast. Like a deputy sheriff's star? She didn't bother with greetings. "You can't park your truck like that," she said flatly, pointing toward the gravel edge of my drive where my Ram 2500 sat angled off the path. "This is community property. The HOA has standards." I blinked at her, half expecting someone to shout, "Prank!" "From the trees. I just moved in," I replied calmly. "Pretty sure that patch of gravel is on my side of the property line?" She scoffed like I'd insulted her ancestry. "The whole area around your cabin is within the HOA boundary. Didn't your realtor explain that to you?" I leaned against the doorframe and gave her a slow once-over. "My realtor didn't need to explain anything," I said with a hint of finality. "I own this land outright. The HOA doesn't apply here." That set her off. She stiffened like someone had pulled a ripcord in her spine. "All properties in the lakeshore development fall under our purview," she said, emphasizing our. Like she was speaking for a kingdom. "You can't opt out just because you feel like it? That includes your little rustic? Project here." She gave my cabin a glance like it was something she stepped in. I held her gaze a moment longer than was polite. Then I stepped back and closed the door. Not slammed, just firm, like placing a bookend on the conversation. But that was only the beginning. Over the next 3 days, I learned more about this woman than I ever cared to. Her name was Karen, of course, and she was the self-appointed president of the HOA board, a role she held with the same vigor and gravity of a wartime general. Apparently, the Lakeshore HOA had expanded its reach over the years by annexing surrounding lots that had once been independent properties until only a few remained outside their jurisdiction. Mine, it seemed, was the crown jewel. The cabin sat at the very tip of the lake, surrounded on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by a winding gravel road that cut through a sliver of forest. When I bought it, I'd purchased not just the home, but the land, the easement, the road, and most importantly, the original bridge that connected the lake's northern developments to the mainland. I'd done my research. While the HOA controlled the majority of the lakeside homes, their only access point passed directly through my property. And Karen? She hadn't read the fine print. That became abundantly clear when I received the first violation notice tucked under my windshield wiper. It cited unauthorized fencing around my vegetable garden and non-standard window treatments on the 2nd floor. I didn't bother responding. Then came the emails, then the visits. On the 4th visit, Karen brought 2 other board members, both of whom looked thoroughly embarrassed to be there. She waved a printout of community bylaws in my face and informed me that the HOA would be issuing a daily fine until I removed the fence, repainted the shutters, and brought the property into visual harmony with community standards. I asked if she'd like to see the deed. She declined. "You're not above the rules," she snapped. "You're part of a community now, whether you like it or not." "Funny," I replied. "That's not what the county assessor's office says." She stormed off. That night, I sat by the fireplace with a glass of bourbon and reviewed the title documents for the 15th time. Everything was in order. Not only did I own the cabin and surrounding acreage, but I also held the deed to the easement road and the private bridge that connected Lakeshore HOASS route. Karen's kingdom had one road, and it ran straight through my backyard. I didn't buy the cabin by accident. I had grown up coming to this lake with my grandfather, a quiet man with a sharp legal mind and a sharper eye for land grabs. Before he died, he'd warned me that the area was being overrun by HOAs masquerading as lakefront lifestyle communities. He told me if I ever wanted peace, I'd need to buy land with leverage. Don't buy the lakefront, he'd said. Buy the road. Now, I understood what he meant. On the 5th day, the first real escalation happened. I returned from town to find my access gate sealed shut with a heavy padlock and a metal sign that read property under HOA review, access restricted. It looked official, fonts matched the letterhead, but it was a bluff, an illegal one. I cut the lock with bolt cutters, took the sign, and hung it upside down on a tree with a note, "Nice try, Karen." The next day I filed a formal trespass complaint with the sheriff's office and had a private security firm install motion-triggered cameras on the drive. By the time Karen came back with a code enforcement officer, I had footage, maps, deeds, and a letter from my lawyer ready to go. The officer took one look at the paperwork and told Karen he had no jurisdiction. She fumed like a tea kettle, turning so red I thought she might combust. Then 2 days later, the resort-wide HOA email blast went out. Urgent notice, road maintenance, it read. The HOA would be sealing off the bridge for temporary repairs, and all residents were advised to limit non-essential travel. I drove down to the bridge that afternoon and found HOA volunteers setting up orange cones and redirect signs on my land. I stepped out of the truck, phone in hand, and hit record. "You're trespassing," I said calmly. One of the volunteers, an older guy with a sun hat and a clipboard, looked at me in confusion. "Karen said we had permission," he muttered. I smiled. "She lied." I pointed toward the truck. "You've got 5 minutes to clear out before I have the sheriff here again." They left. The next morning I sent the HOA board a certified cease and desist letter outlining the legal boundaries of my property, the invalidity of their claims, and an invoice for damages and legal fees incurred thus far. I CC'd the county, the sheriff's office, and the local paper. That afternoon, Karen showed up alone, no badge, no clipboard, just a storm cloud of fury trailing her like a cape. "What do you want?" she snapped. I took a deep breath, stepped aside, and let her see the massive roll of construction fencing I'd had delivered. "You've made it clear that your community doesn't recognize my property rights," I said coolly, "so I'm returning the favor. Starting next week, the road and bridge are closed for restoration, no access granted. You'll need to find another way in." Her jaw dropped. "You can't just block the road. You'll be cutting off the entire community." "That's not my problem," I replied. "According to your bylaws, you have easement agreements, but only if they're honored in good faith. You broke that." She sputtered something about lawsuits and injunctions, but it was too late. I had the title. I had the footage, I had the receipts, and more importantly, I had time. That night, as the stars blinked over the lake and frogs sang from the cattails, I walked the length of the bridge and marked off every segment I planned to fence. Karen and her board had built their kingdom on arrogance, but they'd done so on land they didn't control. And now, with the pressure mounting and no access to the outside world but the road through my gate, the reckoning was just beginning. The following week rolled in like a thunderstorm, slow, brooding, and full of tension you could taste in the air. I didn't have to wait long before the repercussions of my road closure echoed through the HOA like a siren call of accountability. By Tuesday morning, the bridge was fenced, gated, and bolted with 3 separate locks. I even installed a camera with live feed capabilities connected directly to my phone, ensuring no one tried to sneak across. I'd posted clear signage on either side: private property, nitrogen monoxide, trespassing, road closed for repairs, entry by written permission only. Beneath that, in smaller letters, I'd included my lawyer's contact info and a reference to the easement clause they had violated. Naturally, Karen didn't take that well. The first message came by email typed in bold red letters and full of exclamation marks. She threatened legal action, called me a squatter, accused me of domestic terrorism, and ended with a demand to immediately cease obstructing community access. I forwarded the message to my attorney with a one-word subject line: delusional. The next day, I was sipping coffee on my porch when I heard the unmistakable sound of distant honking short, frustrated bursts, Like Morse code for entitlement? I strolled down the hill with my travel mug and found a line of SUVs and sedans, backed up at the locked gate with Karen's white Range Rover at the front. She was out of her vehicle, pacing, phone glued to her ear, gesturing wildly at the fence. When she saw me approaching, her face twisted into that specific expression only HOA Karens can summon, rage barely restrained by a veneer of performative civility. "You've stranded an entire neighborhood," she yelled before I could say a word. "People have jobs, school pickups, grocery runs. What the hell do you think you're doing?" I calmly took a sip of my coffee. "Enforcing my property rights. Same as you tried to do with your fake fines and signs." She marched toward me, phone still in hand. "You are not allowed to cut off an access road that services over 90 homes. That's obstruction. That's endangerment. We'll sue you for every penny you've got." "Good luck with that," I replied. "I've got recorded trespasses, forged HOA notices, and now video of you violating a court-acknowledged easement agreement. You want to play legal chicken, Karen? Blink first." She turned to the gathered residents, shouting for someone to call the police. "Call them," I offered. "They've already been out here twice. They confirmed it's private land. They can come again if you like. I'll serve them coffee too." That's when one of the residents, a man in his 50s, wearing a company polo, stepped out from the third car in line and raised his hand like he was in a PTA meeting. "Wait, are you saying we've been driving over land that's not owned by the HOA this whole time?" I nodded. "That's correct. This road, the forested easement, and the bridge, it's all deeded to me. I bought it outright. The HOA doesn't own an inch of it." Murmurs rippled through the line of cars. Karen's face went pale, and she began shouting something about how I was just a squatter with paperwork, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. I turned to leave, pausing only to look back and say, "Have your attorney contact mine. Otherwise, the bridge stays closed until further notice." That night, my email lit up with messages, not from Karen, but from actual homeowners. Some angry, others confused, but a surprising number were apologetic. Turns out, not everyone in Lakeshore HOA was thrilled with how things were run. Karen had made enemies over the years, forcing people to repaint homes, fining residents for leaving holiday decorations up too long, even banning solar panels because they disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. One guy named Glenn, a retired Navy vet, reached out and said, "I knew something was off about her. If there's anything we can do to support you, say the word." That gave me an idea. Over the next week, while Karen frantically tried to rally the HOA board to take legal action, I started gathering allies. I invited Glenn and a few others up to my cabin, walked them through the history of the property, showed them the deeds, and explained how I'd bought not just the land, but the control point for their only road. I laid out the facts. The HOA had violated the original easement terms by attempting to assert jurisdiction, place signage, and issue fines on land they didn't own. That nullified the good faith clause in their access rights. Several were stunned. A few were furious not at me, but at Karen. The more people I talked to, the more the story spread, and soon enough, I wasn't the lone cabin recluse. Being painted as a villain, I was the guy who'd pulled the curtain back on the HOA's power play. Then came the final straw. Karen tried to bring in a private construction crew to build an emergency bypass road through the woods behind my property. I caught wind of it through one of my new friends, Jennifer, a mother of two who worked at the county clerk's office. She'd overheard a permit request filed under the HOA's name and tipped me off. That same night, I was waiting in the woods with my camera when the bulldozer arrived. I let them start clearing brush for about 5 minutes before stepping into the headlights and shouting, "Stop, you're trespassing." The driver threw it into reverse so fast he nearly ran over one of the flag markers. I called the sheriff again, and this time I submitted the footage to the local news. It didn't take long for the story to spread. HOA attempts illegal. Road construction on private land. The news story featured drone shots of the bridge, close-ups of the locked gate, and even a brief interview with yours truly. I kept it professional, stating that I supported the community but would not tolerate legal overreach or private property violations. By the next morning, my inbox had tripled with supportive messages. Karen, she went silent. Radio silent? The HOA board issued a brief statement saying they were reviewing access policy and working with property owners to resolve the matter, but the damage was already done. Residents started showing up at HOA meetings demanding a recall vote. A petition circulated. One particularly angry homeowner, a guy named Carlos, stood up and read from a printout of my land deed, highlighting the original boundaries. The room exploded in applause. Karen resigned 2 days later. No announcement. No apology, just a notice posted to the HOA website stating that due to unforeseen health concerns, she would be stepping down. Her name was scrubbed from the directory within 48 hours. The new acting president? Glenn. First order of business? A formal apology to me in writing, signed by the board. Second order? A renegotiated easement agreement that acknowledged the road and bridge as private property, with annual compensation paid directly to me for maintenance and access. Oh, and a clause stating that the HOA could never, under any circumstance, attempt to assert authority over my land again. I didn't charge much. Just enough to cover plowing in the winter, gravel upkeep, and maybe a few luxuries like solar panels and a new ATV. I let the bridge open again the following week. The residents waved as they passed, some even honking in gratitude. One family dropped off a pie. Jennifer brought me fresh eggs. Life settled back into rhythm, calm, steady, with the wind off the lake carrying the scent of pine and justice. But I'd learned something valuable. Karen thought her power was absolute because she had a board and a binder full of rules. The power means nothing without land to stand on. And in the end, I had the one thing she couldn't bully, buy, or legislate: ownership, not just of a cabin, but of the very road beneath their tires. And in this town, that made me the quiet king. It didn't take long after the dust settled for the consequences of Karen's downfall to ripple through the entire lakeshore community like a rock thrown into still water. With Glenn now acting president of the HOA and the truth about the land. Ownership out in the open, things around the lake got quieter, at least on the surface. But as any landowner knows, peace is never permanent when you hold power over something other people think they deserve. The board had signed the renegotiated easement contract, and they'd begun making annual payments directly to me for access. The bridge was now under legal agreement mine to maintain, theirs to use, and no longer under the illusion of HOA authority. They even agreed to pay for a portion of the maintenance and install an emergency gate with my control code. But after Karen's resignation, the HOA's internal politics started to splinter. Apparently, she hadn't just abused power, she'd mismanaged funds too. A quiet audit revealed thousands of dollars in community improvement expenses that were never accounted for. Legal fees paid to firms no one could trace. Landscaping projects that never happened. Even a supposed security camera system that didn't exist. Suddenly, the homeowners weren't just frustrated. They were angry, and many of them looked to me not as an outsider, but as someone who had taken a stand. Jennifer started jokingly calling me Mayor of the Hill. I laughed, but the name stuck. People started showing up at my cabin asking questions about bylaws, permits, even asking for help dealing with their own HOA fines from years past. I wasn't a layer, but I knew how to read contracts, and I'd learned the language of land like it was carved into my bones. It felt strange being this central, but I didn't mind. Especially when I saw how grateful people were just to have someone stand up to the bully who'd ruled over them for years with fines and threats and her smug smile. But while most of the community was warming up to the change, there were still remnants of Karen's loyalists lurking around. A man named Vernon, former HOA treasurer, took it upon himself to become the new thorn in my side. He'd been Karen's right hand, and even though he wasn't voted into any leadership role, he strutted around like he was still the one pulling the strings. One day, I caught him trying to inspect my property line clipboard in hand, phone out, snapping, Photos of my newly installed solar panels. You know, those might violate Lakeshore's reflective surface policy. He told me, chin raised like he was about to hand me a ticket. You might want to review the aesthetic compliance guidelines. I raised an eyebrow and pointed to the metal placard bolted beside my porch. Private land. Not under HOA jurisdiction? You want to file a complaint? Send it to the county they approve the install? He huffed and muttered something about community values as he trudged back. Down the road. That was the start of Vernon's little campaign. Over the next month, I noticed more strange vehicles circling the bottom of the hill, drones buzzing overhead. Even once, someone on foot trying to sneak around the back of my cabin under the excuse of bird watching. I started keeping tighter perimeter motion lights, more cameras, even posted some legal notices for trespassing with specific language about prosecution. But Vernon didn't stop there. I caught wind that he was trying to rally a special committee within the HOA to sue for eminent domain, a ridiculous longshot that had no legal standing, especially on private land with title history as solid as mine. But still, it was a sign that power, even when defeated, doesn't give up easily. So I made a preemptive move. I scheduled a town hall meeting not under the HOA, but as a private landowner offering transparency to the residents who used my road daily. I rented the community lodge, printed out full-sized maps showing my parcel, the easement zones, and the new access agreements. I included the bridge inspection reports, winter road plowing receipts, and even cost estimates showing how much they saved by not having to maintain their own access. When I stood up to speak, over 70 residents showed up. I wasn't dramatic. I kept it simple. I'm not here to cause division. I just want the facts clear and your access guaranteed, without interference from people misusing their authority. I ended the meeting by offering a plan of permanent access trust, governed by contract law, not subject to board elections or AOM. The trust would guarantee access in perpetuity with minimal yearly fees locked in and all maintenance handled professionally. I even offered to sign a no development clause on my side of the lake to preserve the natural environment. The room burst into applause. People lined up to sign their names to the trust interest list. Vernon stood in the back, arms crossed, seething. A week later, he tried to file an injunction against the trust. It was dismissed in court within days. Turns out the new HOA board wasn't interested in fighting me. They wanted stability. They'd seen what happened when you underestimate a landowner with a long memory and a tighter legal playbook. So they let the trust go forward. We filed the agreement with the county, and with it, I secured not just control, but peace. Now the bridge carried more than just cars. It carried respect. Every time someone drove across, they knew it was because I'd allowed it, because I'd chosen community over revenge. I didn't waive their debts, but I gave them a path forward. That mattered. But if you thought that was the end of the story, you don't know rural politics. One rainy afternoon, about 6 months after the trust was filed, I got a knock on my door. It was Jennifer, drenched, holding a folder. "You're going to want to see this," she said. Inside was a land survey map, brand new, just filed. And it showed a suspicious dotted line running from the other side of the lake, looping around my land and connecting to the county highway. "They're trying to bypass your road entirely," she said. Some developers offering to fund a secondary bridge route through the wetland behind Lot 72. That land was technically owned by a shell company, one that, we discovered, Karen had quietly set up years ago. She'd disappeared from the HOA, but she hadn't given up her dream of control. I had to laugh. She just couldn't help herself. That's when I knew this war wasn't over. It had just gone underground, but this time I was ready. I contacted my lawyer, filed environmental impact assessments, coordinated with state conservation groups, that wetland, protected. Endangered species, historical marshland status, it was untouchable. I submitted the findings to the county commission, and the application for development was denied before they could even hold a vote. A few weeks later, the shell company folded. Karen's last card played, last trick wasted. She had tried to sneak her way back into relevance and lost again. And I didn't need to make a speech or send a letter or show up at her door. She knew, she saw the news report. She watched the permits get rejected. And when she drove by the lake, I made sure the new sign on the bridge was crystal clear. This road brought to you by the landlord you tried to evict. Life returned to a quiet kind of harmony after that. I kept to myself mostly, but neighbors waved more often now. Kids played in the woods by my fence. Jennifer came by regularly with fresh eggs and updates from the county clerk's office. I'd built a greenhouse, planted herbs, started writing. Maybe someday I'd sell the story, change the names, dramatize the bridge, make Karen the villain she so desperately wanted to be. But until then, I just sat on my porch, coffee in hand, wind off the lake, knowing that in a world full of Karens and HOAs, I had something none of them could take: backland, leverage, and the last laugh. After the attempted bypass bridge failed and Karen's shadow operation crumbled, the lakeshore community finally settled into a rare stretch of peace that almost felt too quiet to trust. But I'd learned enough by now to never relax fully when dealing with an HOA, especially one with a history of abuse, deceit, and a taste for power cloaked in bylaws and block parties. My role as the unofficial figurehead of stability had become both a responsibility and a warning label. I wasn't just the guy who owned the land under their bridge. I was the one who held the receipts, the contracts, and the memory of every single time they tried to take what wasn't theirs. So, when the county sent me a letter requesting a meeting about infrastructure adjustments related to community expansion, I already knew trouble was on the horizon. The meeting turned out to be a prelude to the HOA's newest ambition, a plan to install underground fiber optic lines throughout the neighborhood, including a main trunk that would have to be buried directly through my land. The audacity wasn't even the surprising part, it was that they had already signed contracts with the utility provider, assuming they could strong-arm the easement. This time, they weren't even hiding behind Karen or Vernon. A new board member, named Stacy, brought it to my door with a bright smile and a packet full of papers saying, "We figured since this benefits everyone, you'd be open to cooperating." I flipped through the contract and found the kicker: zero compensation, full control granted to the HOA, and a clause giving them perpetual access to the trench path for future municipal utility needs. In short, they wanted a private telecom highway through my land, for free, with rights forever. I smiled right back and said no. That one word turned into weeks of emails, calls, then threats. They said I was obstructing community progress, that I'd become unreasonable. They tried rallying public opinion, again posting HOA newsletters that painted me as refusing to cooperate with technological advancement, but people weren't buying it this time. I'd earned too much good faith from residents after protecting the bridge, preserving the wetlands, and shielding them from another round of Karen's chaos. Still, I didn't sit back and wait for their next bad move. I called a civil engineer, drew up an alternative fiber route that circled their homes through county right-of-way, and presented it at my own cost to both the HOA and the telecom company. The company jumped on board immediately. The HOA board, humiliated, had no choice but to approve the reroute. That's how I turned their greedy attempt at free land into another opportunity to prove just how unnecessary their arrogance had become. But even then, Stacy knew Karen in disguise wasn't finished. She pushed a new proposal to purchase the land at the base of the hill, arguing it was a security risk to have non-HOA land so close to their main entrance. What she didn't know was that I'd already donated that parcel to the local fire department 6 months earlier. I hadn't announced it, hadn't posted signs, just quietly signed the deed over in exchange for emergency access improvements and long-term patrol coverage. So when Stacy marched into a county meeting to protest the fire department's fence installation and got shut down by the fire chief himself, she was stunned speechless. The footage of her stammering, but that's HOA jurisdiction, went semi-viral among residents. After that, she stopped showing up at board meetings altogether. In the following months, something remarkable happened. The OA began to shrink not in size but in relevance. More homeowners started pushing for deregulation of bylaws, voting to remove fines, and rolling back Karen-era amendments. A new generation of residents came in, saw the mess for what it was, and decided they'd rather live under respect than rules. The board became less of a threat and more of a planning committee for holiday lights and potlucks. They lost their teeth, and I didn't even need to file another lawsuit to make it happen. Meanwhile, I kept improving my land. The cabin got a new roof, the docks were restored, and I even built a small guest house out back with reclaimed lumber from a barn Karen once tried to have condemned. Jennifer helped me design it. She'd become more than just a county clerk friend. She was part of my life now, and her insight into bureaucratic nonsense made her both a lifesaver and a brilliant dinner companion. One summer afternoon, while we were watching the sun slide down across the lake, she looked at me and asked, "Do you think it's finally over?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sipped my coffee and watched a pair of kids laughing from paddleboards below. Then I said, "It'll never be over." "Not really. There's always going to be someone who wants to take what they think they're owed, but now they know there's someone up here who won't let them." That became the tone for everything after. I didn't just own land, I defended it. I didn't just write contracts, I wrote lines in the sand. Every paved path, every trimmed tree, every mailbox post was a symbol of someone who thought they could control what wasn't theirs and learned otherwise. Eventually, I published an article in a small rural justice magazine, telling the whole story from the first knock on the door to the final victory at the county courthouse. It went modestly viral. Then I got invited to speak at a land rights symposium, and from there, I found myself consulting on HOA resistance cases across the country. Some people tried to turn me into a hero. I refused. I wasn't a hero. I was just the one who knew the deed better than they knew their rule book. But I did write a book titled "It Lines They Shouldn't Have Crossed." It sold more than I expected. One kept a few copies in a box under the guest house bed, one signed for Jennifer. My lake, once the source of chaos, became a sanctuary. The residents started calling it Landlord Lake, half joking, half grateful. And on the 10th anniversary of the day Karen first stormed in shouting about easements, the community threw a celebration. They invited me, of course. I showed up in boots and a flannel shirt, stood under the string lights, and watched the band play near the water. Someone handed me a plaque for preserving what they tried to steal. I didn't say much, just raised it in the air, nodded, and smiled. Because in the end, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need a fight, I just needed what was mine to stay mine. And every time someone tried to take it, they reminded me why the fight was worth it. They reminded me why land matters, why lines matter, and why sometimes the quiet guy in the cabin ends up being the loudest voice in the room without ever